but I do want to move this along. So I would like to ask Marta Johnson and Wendy Schlett, who Marta's put together this workshop called Environmental Implications of COVID, which is a really big topic. And I'm going to ask her to do it in 10 minutes. Please.
No problem.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure. All right. First of all, my name is Marta. I am the founder of Tree Shrugger, which is a purpose-driven business to help busy, multi-passionate people take action and do something meaningful for climate change. I'm here today because in my work, I've been seeing the deep interconnections between COVID and climate change. I approach things with a behavioral design and behavior change theory lens in developing the solutions and how we can communicate with ourselves, each other about climate change. And COVID has certainly sharpened some perspective on that. So let me quickly present here to give you perhaps not things that you haven't necessarily thought of before, but just with maybe a little fresh lens on that. So first, let's see here. I'm so sorry. There are three main things I wanted to interlace. Now we could get into a lot of scientific deep data on this, but I wanted to keep things light and 10,000 foot view. So I wanted to highlight the complicated here. I think it's been pointed out before that there are climate change and pandemics in general are deeply related, both because the mechanisms that contribute to climate change and accelerating interactions between the environment, including animals and people, that increase the likelihood of exchange of new viruses and introducing new viruses that could potentially act similarly to COVID-19. We also know that make it more challenging to control the spread and deal with multiple crises at once. When we look at flooding on top of COVID spread or wildfire, controlled wildfire, as well as the relationship between air quality and asthma, and then also and experiences once you are contracting COVID, likelihood of contracting COVID. So there's a complicated relation, but there's definitely a lot of interconnectedness between COVID-19 and climate change. Similar issue is the political challenge to it. We've seen the politicization of science and treating science, climate change, public health, and the issue of or various public health measures to slow or stop the spread in a highly partisan context. We have in Michigan a very example of that as the Republican-led House are urging for more action and more work on the part of public to slow this down with these public health measures. So in climate change, we see very similar trends as well. And what that shows us is, both for COVID, but also for climate change, is we need a bridge between now and the future that we want, which is lower rates of positivity as well in the near term for the pandemic, but also for a bright climate future. We need to have both parties coming to the table supporting common sense policies, whether it's at the local level related to trucks on our streets and creating pollution issues at the very hyper local level, or whether it's related to something like our global climate agreement and having the necessary mechanisms to get towards the big global change we need for climate change. So the importance of behavior changing where we are now is incredibly and a really valuable tool for us to think about. So in order to start building that normative support for climate policy and doing something about climate change. We also see that we get short-term gains on things. So when we were able to, in March, really hunker down and stay home safe, mask up, keep social distance, we were kind of learning and all of these things, we saw that we were able to really get things much more under control. And right now we're seeing a resurgence of that and an effort to kind of remind ourselves on these practices, maybe refresh our practices a bit. Potentially there's some chatter about potential shutdown in the future if things continue to get worse. We're looking at all of the tools that we can do. We can see that there are short-term gains with climate change. Similarly, because a lot of our economic activity that contributes to climate change was altered, that more people weren't driving to work, production was lower, so you have lower emissions from producing less stuff that has a high carbon. Able to see air quality improve in cities. We were able to also see, to a lesser extent, particulate matter decline. But overall, for the total of the year, it's about 7% less a lower carbon emissions and particulate readings in 2019, which is not nearly where we need to be in terms of the progress towards the goals that we have to reduce worst case scenarios with climate change, really keeping things under 2 degrees Celsius warming for the future. When we think about what are the most important things to get from right now and us in this room, virtual room, to a brighter climate future, it really starts with your sphere of influence. We're not going to be able to yell our way into having other people get past the partisanship of this, but we are able to look at what we can control, which is in our own lifestyle, within our own friends networks, becoming more civically engaged in some of those hyper-local issues. Like we have, I mentioned this in the chat, but area-specific plan, one of the components can speak into our master plan as a city, which we're due for. I think we're in fact maybe overdue for. So this is that would be a local way that you could start getting involved in into making our communities environmentally friendlier and more climate friendly. So as a consumer, so shifting your consumption habits. So what does that look like? What I encourage people is to really break things down into specifics, because it can get really overwhelming when you think of the enormity of climate change or the enormity of the pandemic, to be able to think, well, what can I do? And so my approach at Tree Shrugger is thinking about breaking things down into specific things that you can make. So like you're driving, you're eating, with civic engagement, creating habits around, setting aside time for reading on relevant topics related to either climate change or the pandemic, so that you're feeding your brain with and keeping active around the issues that you really care about, rather than maybe seeing just headlines occasionally that can alarm you and not necessarily you deeply engaged in knowing what's happening and things are moving. And then, as a conscious consumer, buying less and more ethically. And really the thing that will help for the longer term, and as well as help you have a easier time with change, is to make things small and repeatable so that they can go on autopilot. So that's why I approach things at Tree Shrugger in the way of helping people develop habits and starting small and simple, so that you can eventually, over a year or a couple of years, realize a larger change, like reduced traffic from trucks, or seeing habits grow over time that make you realize that you're making a bigger impact for climate change in your own personal life. So for lifestyle, having one vegetable day, or taking 10 minutes to read a story about climate change, having a 7-day timer to, instead of purchasing something new, taking time to try to find it secondhand or borrowing it from a friend. Simple things that you can start putting on autopilot so that it can grow over time, instead of feeling frustrated that you're not able to do, become a vegan completely overnight, or give up your car overnight. These are like figuring out a plan to make small steps, and also framing it to living better. This are the things that and the Amy Brower is doing a great job in this last implementation phase, and kind of helping making sure that the education is out there. And I think some people call it winning hearts and minds for ourselves. I think instead of looking at climate change or a pandemic with shame or out of control fear, I think there's a valid, some healthy fear, guilt, and instead look at, you know, what we can unlock with short-term with these changes in benefit in the short term. So really training it to like, okay, well, you know, whether or not you're able to remote work, I'm not driving as much, so maybe I can you know, throw on a mask and go for a walk and just de-stress for 10 minutes around the block instead of driving. And that could be my commute, but just like settle my brain. Or maybe I'm feeling some benefits digestively from eating less meat and more plants. I think when we reframe things, it helps invite us to experience it in a way that's more sustainable for us, and creating longer term change. And that also invites other people into that as well, which I think when we look at how highly partisan things are right now, as well as just cultural divisions, the more that we can enjoy these, have it reframed in that sense, it helps. So I don't know if I went over, I'm sorry. Once you start talking, it's hard to keep track of time, but I am happy to answer questions, probably not now, but later on, if anybody wants to get in touch. I do also have a free little Start Getting Active Now that I'll pop into there. I just popped it in the link because I think the whole idea of like getting yourselves centered on what you're going to activate around and just like making a plan to take action is so valuable and important. So I hope that people find that valuable, to figuring out and putting it into action. What's a simple thing that I can do where I can make an impact in my sphere of influence and where I have power.
Thank you so much, Marta. And that was just mean of us to make you do it in 10 minutes or less. But again, I got a plan that's forming in my head. I think there were a couple of questions. I know Abby was concerned about the impact of using things like disposable sanitizing wipes and other consumables that feel necessary during COVID, and probably, you know, so how do we balance that? How much responsibility lies with us to make the right choice, and how much responsibility lies with companies to provide better choices?
I will give you my as quick of answer as I can on that. Is I think for so long we have framed things with environmental living or behavior change in terms of how we can buy a more eco-friendly version and becoming experts in or kind of like a consumer responsibility to do the right thing. And I do think you're right in the sense that, you know, we don't have to feel like it's all our responsibility to do every single thing right. And I think you just have decision fatigue at a certain point, especially with how complicated and more difficult and challenging work is right now during the pandemic. I mean, the Zoom, you know, little breakout room thing was just one example of that. So I would say focus on what feels doable and realistic and simple, instead of looking at all of the enormity of everything in terms of the extra consumables that you're dealing with. And if you take on one simple thing that you actually say, I don't like this, it doesn't feel right, whether it's like bottled water or something else, that can help you stay focused and start to feel some success in that change, and remove that that pain or annoyance that you're feeling, or keep getting worried or that sort of thing. But instead of thinking of it like I'm doing this because it's my responsibility to solve all these problems, think of it as, you know, how can I lighten my like mental load right now, feel better about like doing one thing, to keep moving forward. I think, you know, with COVID, I think there has been some really valid concerns about things like disposable masks and other things. So I mean, shifting to reusables as much as possible, just like any other environmental environmental living advice of, you know, lower impact versus higher impact on the planet is wise, but it's also going to be very challenging to take on every single one of those. So from my perspective, instead of becoming too overwhelmed, pick a thing to say, hey, notice that, you know, changes have accumulated because we're in the middle of a pandemic and our whole lives have been turned upside down. My habits have changed. Here's one thing I want to do to start lightening my load on the planet.